It was just a proud family photo in 1872, but the girl's hand tells a different story. The photograph sat in a climate-controlled archive in Richmond, Virginia, its edges yellowed, but its image remarkably clear. 7 figures stood before a wooden backdrop, frozen in time. A man and woman in their 30s, flanked by 5 children. The father wore a dark suit that seemed slightly too large, his hand resting protectively on the shoulder of the oldest boy. The mother's dress was simple but clean, her posture rigid with dignity. The children ranged in age from what appeared to be 5 to 14 years old, 2 girls and 3 boys, all dressed in their finest clothes. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had seen thousands of photographs from the Reconstruction era, but something about this one made her pause. She was cataloging donations to the Virginia Historical Society when she pulled this image from a box labeled Unidentified Families, 1870-1875. The photograph had no names, no location beyond Virginia, no context. Just 7 souls staring into the camera lens with expressions that seemed to carry the weight of the world. She held the image under the magnifying lamp, studying each face. The father's jaw was set firm, his eyes intense with something Sarah couldn't quite name. Pride, perhaps, or determination. The mother's gaze was softer but equally powerful, protective. The children stood in a carefully arranged line, the older ones in back, the younger in front. They all looked directly at the camera, none smiling, as was common in photographs of that era when exposure times were long and subjects were told to remain perfectly still. What struck Sarah most was how carefully they had been posed, how deliberately arranged. This wasn't a casual family portrait. This was a statement. Someone had taken great care to ensure that every person was visible, every face clear, every detail preserved. The family had dressed in their best clothes, the girls in matching dark dresses with white collars, the boys in suits that might have been hand-me-downs or borrowed. There was an intentionality here that spoke of importance, of marking a significant moment. Sarah made a note to examine the photograph more closely later. For now, she labeled it Family Portrait, circa 1872 Virginia, and moved on to the next item in the box. But throughout the day, her mind kept returning to those 7 faces, to the unnamed family who had stood before that camera 150 years ago. She couldn't shake the feeling that their story, whatever it was, deserved to be told. 3 weeks later, Sarah returned to the photograph. She had finished the initial cataloging and was now conducting detailed analysis of the most intriguing images. Using the Society's new high-resolution scanner, she began creating a digital copy of the family portrait, zooming in to capture every detail that the original photographer had preserved. She started with the parents, noting the texture of their clothing, the style of the father's collar, the way the mother's hair was pulled back in a simple bun. These details would help establish a more precise date and possibly a location. She moved to the children, examining their faces, their postures, their hands folded neatly in front of them. When Sarah zoomed in on the younger daughter, the girl who appeared to be about 12 years old, standing second from the right, her breath caught in her throat. The girl's left hand rested at her side, partially visible at the edge of her dark dress. At first glance, it had been easy to miss, but magnified, enlarged, impossible to ignore, Sarah saw what had been hidden in plain sight for 150 years. The girl's wrist bore deep, circular scars. Not a single mark, but layers of them. Old wounds that had healed over time, but left permanent evidence of their existence. Sarah had studied enough historical trauma to recognize what she was seeing. Shackle scars. The kind left by iron restraints, worn for extended periods, cutting into skin, healing, and being reopened again and again. Her hands trembled as she moved the cursor, examining the image more closely. The scarring was extensive, wrapping around the entire circumference of the small wrist. Sarah felt a wave of nausea wash over her. This girl, this child, had been bound, restrained, held captive. She quickly zoomed to the other family members, searching for similar marks. The older sister's hands were mostly hidden in the folds of her dress, but Sarah could make out what might be similar scarring on her right wrist. The father's hands were clasped in front of him, positioned in a way that suddenly seemed deliberately concealing. The mother's hands were completely hidden. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. This wasn't just any family portrait from 1872. This photograph had been taken only 7 years after the end of the Civil War, during the early years of Reconstruction. The formal clothing, the rigid postures, the careful arrangement, it all took on a new meaning. This family wasn't simply posing for a photograph. They were documenting something, declaring something, proving something. The scars on that 12-year-old girl's wrist told a story that the photograph's surface could never reveal. This was a family who had lived through something unimaginable, who had survived something that had left permanent marks on their bodies. And they had chosen, or someone had chosen for them, to have their image captured and preserved at a specific moment in their lives. Sarah knew she was looking at something significant, but what exactly? And who were these people? Sarah spent the next morning making phone calls. She contacted colleagues at Howard University, historians who specialized in African American life during Reconstruction, archivists who had studied former enslaved families. She sent the high-resolution images to Dr. Marcus Williams, a renowned expert on post-Civil War photography at the Smithsonian, with a simple message: "What do you see here?" Marcus called her back within 2 hours. His voice was quiet, weighted with emotion. "Sarah, do you know what you found?" he asked. "These aren't just shackle scars. Look at the pattern, the depth, the way they've healed. This child wore restraints for years, not days or weeks, years." They talked for nearly an hour, Marcus walking her through what the physical evidence revealed. The scarring indicated prolonged bondage, likely beginning when the girl was very young. The fact that the marks were visible in the photograph, that they hadn't been hidden or disguised, suggested that the family either didn't realize how clearly they would show, or perhaps, more powerfully, that they wanted them shown, that they were documenting their past as well as their present. Sarah pulled every record she could find from Virginia in the early 1870s. She searched through Freedmen's Bureau documents, marriage records, land deeds, anything that might help identify this family. The problem was that thousands of formerly enslaved people lived in Virginia during this period, and many had no formal documentation. Names had been changed, families separated and reunited, records destroyed or never created in the first place. She examined the photograph for any other clues. The backdrop was simple wood, suggesting a traveling photographer or a temporary studio. The lighting was natural, streaming in from the right side of the frame. She consulted with photography experts who confirmed her estimate. This image was almost certainly taken between 1870 and 1874, based on the photographic technique and the style of clothing. Then Sarah noticed something else. In the lower right corner of the photograph, barely visible, were faint pencil marks on the back that had transferred through to the image. She enhanced the area digitally and could just make out what appeared to be partial letters. Mond. And below it, Free, Richmond. And the word free, or perhaps freedman. Her pulse quickened. She was getting closer. Sarah contacted the Richmond City Archives and requested access to any records related to newly freed families having photographs taken in the early 1870s. The archivist, an elderly woman named Dorothy Chen, was intrigued by Sarah's query. "We have a collection of photographers' ledgers from that period," Dorothy said. Several studios specifically advertised to freedmen and freed women, offering affordable portraits. It was actually quite common. People who had never been allowed to own images of themselves suddenly wanted documentation of their families. "Let me see what I can find." 3 days later, Dorothy called back. "I found something," she said, her voice excited. There was a photographer named Josiah Henderson who ran a studio in Richmond from 1869 to 1876. His ledger book survived, and he kept detailed notes. He specifically reached out to freed families, offering portraits at reduced rates. He believed it was important for people to have a record of their existence, of their families. Sarah drove to Richmond the next morning. Dorothy had the ledger waiting for her, a leather-bound book with pages yellowed by time but still legible. Henderson had recorded each sitting, the date, the number of people, the amount paid, and often brief notes about the families. Sarah turned the pages carefully, scanning through entries from 1872, May, June, July. Then, in August, she found it. Family of 7, father, mother, 2 daughters, 3 sons, recently freed, paid in full, 50 cents. Note, father very particular about arrangement, wanted all children visible, said it was important. There was no name recorded, but there was a location. Jackson Ward. Jackson Ward. One of Richmond's historic African-American neighborhoods, a place where many freed families had settled after the war. Sarah felt the pieces beginning to come together. She spent the afternoon at the Richmond Public Library, going through city directories and tax records from Jackson Ward in the early 1870s. The neighborhood had been home to dozens of freed families, many of whom had taken new names after emancipation or reclaimed names that had been denied to them during slavery. Then, in a property record from 1873, she found a name that made her pause: James Washington. The entry noted that he had purchased a small plot of land in Jackson Ward in March of that year, one of the first freed men in the area to own property. The record listed his occupation as laborer and noted that he lived with his wife and 5 children. Could this be the family in the photograph? Sarah's heart raced as she searched for more information about James Washington. She found a brief mention in a Freedmen's Bureau report from 1868, documenting a family that had been enslaved on a plantation in Hanover County, just north of Richmond. The report was sparse, listing only names and ages: James, age 28, Mary, age 27, Eliza, age 10, Ruth, age 8, Samuel, age 6, Thomas, age 4, Daniel, age 2. The ages lined up. If this was the same family, photographed 4 years later in 1872, the children would be approximately the right ages. Eliza would be 14, Ruth 12, the same age as the girl with the visible scars. Sarah needed more evidence. She needed to find out what had happened to this family, where they had been enslaved, and what their lives had been like both before and after freedom. The photograph was no longer just an image. It was becoming a doorway into a specific family's history, into the brutal reality of what they had endured and somehow survived. Sarah's search led her to the archives of Hanover County, a rural area north of Richmond that had been home to dozens of tobacco plantations before the Civil War. She was looking for records related to James Washington and his family, trying to piece together where they had been enslaved and under what conditions. The county clerk, an older man named Robert, helped her navigate the records. Plantation documentation from that era is spotty, he explained. A lot was destroyed during the war or deliberately burned afterward. Slaveholders didn't want evidence of what they'd done, but some records had survived. Sarah found estate inventories, property transfers, and ledgers that listed enslaved people by first name and age alongside livestock and farm equipment, a dehumanizing practice that made her stomach turn even a century and a half later. In an 1860 census document for Hanover County, she found what she was looking for. A plantation owned by a man named William Cartwright listed 23 enslaved people. Among them were James, male, 20, and Mary, female, 19. Below them were listed Eliza, female, 2, and Ruth, female, infant. Sarah's hands shook as she photographed the document. This had to be them. The ages matched perfectly. James and Mary had been enslaved on the Cartwright plantation, and their children had been born into bondage there. She searched for more information about William Cartwright and found a dark history. Court records from 1858 showed that Cartwright had been accused, though never convicted, of excessive cruelty toward his enslaved workers. A neighbor had reported seeing a young girl, approximately 10 years old, confined in a tool shed for 3 days as punishment for breaking a water jug. The case had been dismissed, the judge ruling that Cartwright had the right to discipline his property as he saw fit. Sarah felt sick. The scars on Ruth's wrist suddenly took on a more specific, more horrifying context. This wasn't just evidence of slavery in general. This was evidence of a childhood spent under the control of a man documented as exceptionally cruel, even by the standards of a system built on cruelty. She found more. A diary entry from a Union soldier who had passed through Hanover County in 1865 during the final weeks of the war described encountering freed slaves from the Cartwright plantation. Found several families in terrible condition. Many showed signs of prolonged abuse. One woman told us children as young as 6 had been shackled to prevent them from following their mothers to the fields. Cannot fathom such inhumanity. 6 years old, Ruth would have been around that age when the war ended. The shackle scars made horrifying sense now. She hadn't been restrained as punishment for some specific offense. She had been restrained simply to keep her in place, day after day, year after year, while her mother worked in the tobacco fields. Sarah's next step was to find out what had happened to the Washington family immediately after the war ended. She contacted the Library of Virginia, which housed the largest collection of Freedmen's Bureau records for the state. These documents, created by the federal agency established to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom, often contain detailed information about families, their struggles, and their attempts to build new lives. An archivist named James helped her search through the Richmond office records from 1865 to 1868. The Bureau was overwhelmed, he explained as they worked. Thousands of people suddenly free but with nowhere to go, no resources, no legal protection. The agents tried to help, but there was never enough money or staff. They found the Washington family's file and records from October 1865. The first entry was written by a bureau agent named Thomas Clark, documenting their arrival in Richmond. A family of 6 arrived from Hanover County. Father James, Mother Mary, children Eliza, 7, Ruth, 5, Samuel, 4, Thomas, 2. 2 more children born since war ended. Daniel, 3 months. Hannah, stillborn buried in Hanover. Family in desperate condition. Children show signs of severe abuse and malnutrition. Mary reports that youngest daughter Ruth was kept in restraints for approximately 3 years. Father reports being whipped more than 200 times during enslavement. Family has no money, no possessions, except the clothes they wear, provided temporary shelter and meal rations. Sarah had to stop reading for a moment. 3 years in restraints. Ruth had been approximately 2 to 5 years old during that time. A toddler, a small child, bound at the wrists for years because a slaveholder wanted to control her movements. The casual brutality of it was overwhelming. The Bureau records continued, documenting the Washington family's struggle to survive. James found work as a day laborer, loading cargo at the Richmond docks. Mary took in washing. The children helped however they could. Agent Clark noted in a December 1865 entry, family making progress despite hardships. James determined to provide for his children. Requests assistance in learning to read, says he wants to sign his own name, wants his children to read the Bible. Another entry from March 1866. Ruth Washington examined by Dr. Patterson, scarring on wrists permanent, some nerve damage, child has nightmares, recommended continued monitoring for trauma effects. The entries continued through 1867 and into 1868, painting a picture of a family slowly, painfully rebuilding their lives. James eventually found steadier work as a carpenter's assistant. Mary joined a church community. The children began attending a freedmen's school established by Northern missionaries. Then, in June 1868, Agent Clark wrote, "James Washington reports he has saved nearly $100. Plans to purchase land. This family represents best of what is possible with determination and support. They have overcome unimaginable circumstances." Sarah traced the family's path forward. The land purchase in 1873, property tax records showing they maintained the land through the 1870s and 1880s, a marriage record for Eliza in 1879, school enrollment records for the younger boys, and then that photograph from 1872, taken almost exactly 7 years after they arrived in Richmond with nothing, a family that had been beaten, starved, shackled, and dehumanized, standing in their best clothes, looking directly into the camera lens, documenting their existence, claiming their humanity, declaring, "We survived. We are here. We are free." Sarah returned to the ledger of Josiah Henderson, the photographer who had taken the portrait. She wanted to understand more about him, about why he had specifically sought out freed families as subjects. Most photographers of that era focused on wealthy white clients. What had motivated Henderson to do something different? She found his story in the archives of the Virginia Historical Society. Josiah Henderson had been born in Pennsylvania in 1839, the son of abolitionists. He had learned photography as a young man and served as a documentation photographer for the Union Army during the Civil War, assigned to record military operations and later the conditions of freed slaves in occupied territories. His war photographs were haunting. Images of contraband camps where escaped slaves had sought refuge, portraits of men, women, and children who had fled plantations, their faces showing both the trauma of what they'd escaped and the uncertain hope of freedom. Henderson had witnessed firsthand the brutality of slavery and its aftermath. After the war, Henderson moved to Richmond specifically to document freed families. Sarah found an interview he'd given to a Philadelphia abolitionist newspaper in 1871. "I have seen things that no person should see. I have photographed people bearing scars that tell stories more powerful than any words. I believe it is essential that we preserve images of these families, that we capture not just their suffering, but their dignity, their survival, their humanity. Future generations must know what these people endured and overcame." Henderson's approach was different from other photographers. He didn't pose his subjects in ways that emphasized their poverty or their status as victims. Instead, he photographed them as families, as individuals with dignity and agency. He let them choose how they wanted to be arranged, how they wanted to be seen. The note in his ledger about the Washington family photograph now made more sense. The father, very particular about arrangement, wanted all children visible, said it was important. James Washington had understood the significance of the photograph. He wanted documentation not just of who his family was in 1872, but of who they had been and what they had survived. He wanted all of his children visible because each one represented a victory against a system that had tried to erase them. He wanted the photograph to be a testimony. Sarah found more of Henderson's work in various archives, dozens of family portraits from the early 1870s, all of freed families in Richmond. Some showed scars. Others showed people in formal poses that mimicked the portraits of wealthy white families, a deliberate claiming of dignity and status. All of them were powerful statements of existence and survival. Henderson had died in 1889, relatively young at 50 years old. His obituary noted that he had been devoted to documenting the lives of freed people and preserving their stories for history. His photographs had been scattered after his death, sold off or donated to various institutions, which explained why the Washington family portrait had ended up in an archive with no identification or context. Sarah's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. She had posted about her research on a historical genealogy forum, sharing the photograph and asking if anyone had information about the Washington family. 2 weeks later, she received an email from a woman named Patricia Johnson in Philadelphia. "I believe that photograph is of my great-great-great-grandmother Ruth," Patricia wrote. "I have a family Bible that belonged to her and the names and dates match. I've been researching our family history for years, trying to piece together the story of what they survived. I had no idea a photograph existed." Sarah called Patricia immediately. They talked for hours. Patricia shared what had been passed down through generations of her family, stories that had been told and retold, memories preserved through oral history because there had been so little written documentation. "Ruth lived until 1934, Patricia explained. "She was 82 years old when she died. My great-grandmother, Ruth's daughter, remembered her talking about the old days, about slavery, about the plantation. Ruth never hid what had happened to her. She said it was important that her children and grandchildren know the truth, that they understand what their people had survived. Patricia sent Sarah copies of pages from the family Bible. Ruth's handwriting, she had learned to write as an adult, documented births, deaths, and marriages. But there was also something else. Several pages where Ruth had written about her childhood, a first-person account of life under slavery. I was born in 1860 on the Cartwright plantation. Ruth had written in careful, deliberate script. I do not remember a time when I was not afraid. Master Cartwright believed children should be trained early. When I was 2 or 3 years old, I was too young to remember exactly, he had iron cuffs put on my wrists. He said it was to keep me from wandering, to make me understand my place. I wore those cuffs every day until the Union soldiers came and told us we were free. I was 5 years old. My mother cried when she took them off my wrists. She had tried so many times to protect me, but there was nothing she could do. That's what slavery was, a mother having to watch her child suffer and being powerless to stop it. Sarah read the passage through tears. This was Ruth's own voice, testifying to what the photograph could only hint at. The scars visible on her wrist in that 1872 portrait were not just evidence of slavery's cruelty, they were part of Ruth's own story, told in her own words. Ruth's account continued, describing life after emancipation, the family's journey to Richmond, the years of struggle and slow progress. She wrote about the photograph too. Papa wanted us all to have our picture made in 1872. He said it was important that we be remembered, that people in the future know we existed, that we were a family. He made sure we were all dressed properly. He made sure we all looked at the camera. He said, "This picture will last longer than any of us. It will tell people we were here, we survived." With Patricia's help, Sarah was able to trace the Washington family forward through time, discovering what had become of each member. It was a story of resilience and determination that stretched across generations. James Washington had continued working as a carpenter, eventually opening his own small shop in Richmond in 1878. He and Mary had remained in Jackson Ward until their deaths. James in 1891 at age 51, Mary in 1897 at 57. They were buried in the colored section of Oakwood Cemetery, and their modest headstones, still standing, identified them as formerly enslaved, forever free. Eliza, the oldest daughter, had married a teacher named Joseph in 1879. She became a seamstress and mother of 6 children. Her descendants, Patricia explained, included teachers, ministers, and civil rights activists. One of Eliza's grandsons had been among the first black students to integrate a Virginia high school in 1960. Samuel, Thomas, and Daniel, the 3 younger boys, had all learned trades. Samuel became a blacksmith, Thomas a mason, Daniel a schoolteacher. All 3 had remained in Richmond, raising families and contributing to their community. Their descendants still lived in Virginia, and Patricia had been in contact with several of them through her genealogical research. But it was Ruth's story that Sarah found most powerful. Despite, or perhaps because of, the trauma she had endured as a child, Ruth had become a fierce advocate for education and children's rights. In the 1890s, when she was in her 30s, she had worked with church groups to establish schools for black children in rural Virginia. She had spoken publicly about her experiences under slavery, not dwelling on the horror, but emphasizing the importance of ensuring such things never happened again. Ruth used to tell her grandchildren about the scars on her wrists, Patricia explained. She would show them and say, "These marks are proof of what hate can do. But I'm still here. I survived. I lived a full life. I raised children who were born free. That's what matters. We don't just survive evil. We overcome it. We build something better." Ruth had married in 1879 and had 7 children, all of whom survived to adulthood, an achievement in an era of high child mortality. She had lived to see all of them educated, to see some of her grandchildren attend college, to witness the slow, difficult progress of her people in the decades after emancipation. Patricia sent Sarah a photograph of Ruth from 1929, taken when she was 69 years old. The elderly woman in the image bore little resemblance to the 12-year-old girl in the 1872 portrait, but the eyes were the same, direct, unflinching, determined. And visible in the photograph, even after nearly 65 years, were the faint scars on her wrists, permanent reminders of a childhood stolen but a life reclaimed. Sarah's research culminated in an exhibit at the Virginia Historical Society, opening in February. She had titled it, "The Washington Family, Survival, Freedom, and Dignity in Reconstruction Virginia." The centerpiece was the 1872 photograph, now properly identified and contextualized, displayed alongside the documents she had uncovered, the Freedmen's Bureau records, Henderson's ledger, Ruth's handwritten testimony, the family Bible, photographs of descendants. The exhibit opening drew hundreds of people. Patricia Johnson and more than 40 members of the Washington family came from across the country, descendants of all 5 children, people who had grown up hearing stories about their ancestors, but who had never seen this photograph, who had never known it existed. Standing before the image, Patricia spoke to the crowd. When Dr. Mitchell first contacted me, I couldn't believe this photograph had survived. I had heard about it from family stories my great-grandmother remembered when it was taken, but we thought it was lost forever. To see it now, to see my great-great-great-grandmother Ruth standing there with her family, to see the evidence of what they endured, but also the dignity with which they carried themselves. It's overwhelming. She pointed to the scars on Ruth's wrist, barely visible in the photograph, but impossible to ignore once you knew they were there. Ruth wanted people to see these marks. She could have hidden them, could have positioned her hand differently, but she didn't. This photograph isn't just about a family that survived slavery. It's about a family that refused to be erased, that insisted on being seen and remembered exactly as they were, scars and all. Sarah addressed the audience, explaining the significance of Henderson's work and the rarity of documented images of freed families from this period. And this photograph was taken at a pivotal moment in American history, she said. 7 years after the end of slavery, during a brief period when it seemed that real racial justice might be possible in the South, the Washington family chose to document themselves at this moment to create a record that would outlast them. They understood that photographs could be powerful tools of memory and testimony. The exhibit included a section on the lives of the 5 children, showing how each had built successful lives despite the trauma of their early years. School records, business licenses, marriage certificates, photographs of children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. A family tree that stretched from 1860 to the present day, from slavery to freedom, from bondage to dignity, from invisibility to recognition. In a quiet corner of the exhibit, Sarah had placed Ruth's own words on the wall, taken from her Bible. I was born in chains, but I did not die in chains. I raised children who never knew bondage. I lived to see my grandchildren read books that I could not read until I was grown. These scars on my wrists are not marks of shame. They are proof that I survived what was meant to destroy me. They are proof that hate did not win. Love did. Family did. Freedom did. The 1872 photograph of the Washington family, once unidentified and stored in a box of forgotten images, had become a powerful historical document. It stood as evidence of one family's suffering and survival, yes, but also as a broader testament to the millions of people who had endured slavery and emerged into freedom with their humanity intact. The scars were visible, would always be visible, could never be erased. But neither could the dignity, the love, the resilience, the refusal to be broken. James Washington had wanted all his children visible in that photograph. He had wanted them remembered. 150 years later, his wish had finally been fulfilled. They were remembered. They were honored. Their story was told, and it would never be forgotten again.